Oh, beautiful. Turn back the clock on that stage. You might have to turn back the clock. Okay, ready.
Bruchim Aboim B'Shem Hashem B'Shem issur. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's shir from Rabbi Yaakov Smith Shlita and Shrotzim Shenem Som Ma'achal Mavushal. Insects found in food. Now what? I have the great schos of sponsoring a shir called Irgun Torah 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Harav Smith.
A few weeks ago, someone called with the shaila. They found in the flour that they used for making 6 pounds of schnitzel. They found bugs. They have no idea what's doing in the actual schnitzel itself, but no doubt about it, in the flour that was used, there was bugs. Now, what's the procedure? What do you do? I just heard just yesterday someone was served soup in a simcha, and in his plate of soup there was a fly. Should he go into the kitchen? Should he tell the people, make an announcement? And then you have a question where you found more than one fly. You found it was infested, and it's a big oilam. So, as we'll see, we have a group of questions that really have one common denominator. A lot has been written, when is bugs not a problem? When is it considered the nirאה לעניים? After all, the microbes that we find in the air that we breathe, Dr. Shulchan in Pei Daled Lamed Vav, even though there are living organisms that we ingest when we breathe, but that's not nirאה לעניים. And then the question is, but most bugs are. And then you question about bugs in fish and bugs in water. But today we're beyond all these fakes. Today it's not just nirאה לעניים. Today it's there. It's motzei. You found it. It's there. There's no question about, is it a bug? Is it there? The question is, if it's in a mixture of foods, b'diavad, is there any type of heta to continue eating the food that you found the bugs in? So what comes to mind, which has to always be mentioned, the Gemara in Makkos, Daf Tezayin Amud Beis, where the Gemara says when a person eats shrotzim, in different types of course, but either there's 4 malchus, 5 or 6, which is basically unprecedented kamat besides the issur lashon hara. So obviously the issur of shrotzim has a very unique chayma. Zok Pri Chadash in our Simon Pei Daled. Why did the Torah make such an emphasis, 4, 5 or 6 lav malchus for one issur? Zok Pri Chadash, understandably, because there's a tartaler yusa. First of all, the fact is that bugs are motzei, always was, always will be. It's not a heintige mishigas. You find already in the earliest achrayim and the Rishonim discuss it. So mitzad echad, it's very, very common, and mitzad sheni, Zok Pri Chadash, it's very hard to clean properly. So a person has to have a strong incentive, a strong deterrent, and that's why we find, unusually so, 4, 5 or 6 lavim on one issur. But we could say, Mida Toiv Meruba, the Baruch Hashem, today we see an Achshadara, a tremendous zihirus in it, the heightened awareness, and I think we are living what the Avinezer wrote in his times in Siman Ayin Tes. Yisrael Kedoshim Ein Bevada Yishmu, V'savi Aleim Birchas Hatoi, Bishama Atzim Yishrotzim, Asher Ika Kedushas Yisrael Tolu B'zeh. We have to always stress the positive, the Mida Toiv Meruba. Klal Yisrael's godless is the zihirus and kashrus b'chlal, but in shrotzim befrat, as we know, Chazal Darshan, the Bershon took us out of Mitzrayim just for that alone, that we're nizar in shrotzim. So it's something that we really have to pay our attention to. What I heard, an interesting limud schus, I think for the first time, but it was very thought-provoking. Let's say I'm a cook, which I'm not, of course. Let's say I found bugs in a big cholent, and I'm the cook in a camp in a Shabbos hotel. A few hundred people. I shouldn't serve cholent, you know. It could be war if I don't serve the cholent. So I know I won't eat, but let me serve the cholent, and the people that are eating, you know, what you don't know doesn't harm you. Or maybe use a more halacha term, Let's say the people that are intending to eat shalom, that have no idea that there's even a suffix of shrotzim, for them, maybe they would qualify to be a misasek. In other words, as we know, a shoygig is someone that ate something thinking it's kosher, it was treif. Shoygig is a ma'isa issur that needs a kapara. You have to bring a carbon. But we know misasek generally is not a ma'isa issur. It's a lower level of an issur. So let me just serve it. They don't know about it. They think they're eating cholent. They're misasek regarding the shrotzim. And for them, maybe it's not so bad. You'll ask the question. The Gemara says increases. You test them based on other places. Misasek b'chalav barayis is also by yitarfa shekein nena. The teretz is obvious. No one enjoys eating, bugs in their cholent. More so. We find 4, 5, or 6 lavim regarding shrotzim. That's if either you're aware of it, or you don't care enough to check. So we could say, lettuce and romaine lettuce and anything that's muchzik is like you're mechaven to eat bugs. That I understand. But maybe in a case where someone knows that other people might be eating bugs in the cholent, so let's consider them misasek and just ignore it. And the question is better than it seems. Rav Sternbach in the Tshuvas Chelik Dalet Siman Kuf Tzadik records a story that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter wrote this shayla to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. If I know someone's about to eat something that has bugs, but he doesn't know about it, could I just allow him to continue and hope that he's a misasek? And strangely enough, Rabbi Yisrael did not respond. Rabbi Akiva Eiger didn't respond. Akiva Eiger was the golden amidas that he had. He didn't respond to a letter. So Rabbi Yisrael once met Rabbi Shlomo Eiger, Rabbi Akiva Eiger's son, and he asked him, I wrote a letter to your father, I didn't get a response. So he goes, I know all about it. My father, with his grace and nivas, wouldn't respond because you wrote the letter and you wrote from Salant, and the Reb Hirsch was the Rav in Salant, and he wouldn't pass into a Salanta, a person because I was covered for the Rav of Salant. But Lamaisi told me, Lishitasa, it's not shver. Now, this is a famous Rabbi Akiva Eiger in the Tshuvas and Siman Ches. Akiva Eiger holds that even though misasek is a lower level than a shoygig and doesn't need a carbon, but it's still a ma'isa issur. And if you see someone about to be misasek, you have to stop him. Because it's not as bad as shoygig, but it's bad enough. Now, in our times, Akiva Eiger is very common when I see someone about to walk by a house that he will put on a light with a motion detector. He's just going to walk by innocently. So he's a classic misasek. So if you hold misasek, just ignore it, let him go. But according to Akiva Eiger, you have to stop a person that's about to be misasek. So here we see that this question might be a heta, except for the fact that misasek is still a ma'isa issur. The Shiva Siyan in the Tshuva Siman Chav Ches asked the same question. Why are you so worried about people eating bugs? Let's call them misasek. So he says the teretz I told you earlier, that if you know that in lettuce there's bugs, and you're mechaven to eat the lettuce, so inevitably you're mechaven to eat the bugs as well. So Zalman in the Mincha Shloima, in Siman Al, in Chelik Al, Siman Vav, also goes with this yisoid. But the truth is, if that's the case, in our story that I know someone's about to eat cholent, and he didn't dream of it being infested with bugs, maybe I could be quiet. But there's another svar to be machmir, and that's a very big concept in our sugya. And that's the very elusive but a very real problem that's called timtum alev. The Pasuk tells us, the Chazal Darshan, that when a person eats tarfus, it's b'tamtem es alev. Now, I can't figure out how timtum alev works, because the Mechab in Shulchan Aruch Yeridei Peyal of Siv Zayin, the Shulchan Aruch says if a woman who is deathly ill and must eat tarfus, not just allowed to, she's a mechuyev to eat tarfus for pekuach nefesh, she should be careful after eating tarfus, don't nurse her child. Why? So the Ramah says because it's going to be metamtim the lave of the child. Now this is incredible. The woman did not do a ma'isa issa, it was a ma'isa mitzvah chiyuv. She's not serving the child the tarfus, dam nekev and asa chalav. So this is the extremely elusive but powerful concept of timtum alev. I once heard from one of my Rabbi, who was a Talmud of Briskerov. He didn't usually say Meiselach, but he once came to yeshiva, to shir. He says, "Ich kenn sich nicht beruhigen." He read a story. Rabbi Kiva was once traveling, and he came to a city. So typically, they all came out to get a bracha. And a woman came to Mamish crying. She has sons, Mitziyanim, but one of her sons, Mamish, has a verstopfte cup, literally. I send him to yeshiva. He doesn't chap. I have a tutor. Nothing goes. So Kiva asked, "Did he ever eat tarfus?" So the woman was shocked. Tarfus, Rebbe, in my house? Ask him if he ever ate tarfus, ever ate out of the house. He goes, Rebbe, we don't eat out of the house. Remember, Rebbe said it was like, they didn't have the candy stores and the restaurant. He goes, ask him if he ever ate out of the house. So she asked the son. He goes, yeah, once I was coming home from yeshiva, and there was freiliche music, and there was a chasana. So I went in, I ate something. So he came back to Kiveg, yeah, he ate by a chasana, it was a heimish chasana. Find out whose chasana it was. And found out the name. Kivega said that's the problem, because this person that remarried, it was a very controversial get, and the Rav Shechnach, you can look it up in Siman Yud Aleph and Yoreh at the end. There's tshuvas from the Rav. The Rav said that he felt the get is pasal mamish, and if the woman remarries, even with the get, she's an eishes ish, and he's geyser that the meat that they serve by the chasana is nevelas utreifus. And this child ate that meat. Now, I have a chakira. Who's a bigger balmoifis? Rabbi Kiva Eiga, that had the eyes to see that? The Rav, whose word made something nevelos utreifus? I think the biggest moifis is the koyach of Timtum Alev, of the child. He couldn't understand Torah because he ate from meat that, like the Rav, was Timtum Alev. So geif hashtei. So definitely that's a factor that really has to pervade all we speak today. But even if you might say for the person eating it is a mesasek, but the halach sanu the chavach lo yisabed. How could you allow a person to eat bugs now? I think it's pashat kipshuta. If someone ate bugs, it's metamtam alev, even if there's no issur, because it doesn't seem to be totally zeh bezeh that there's an issur, that the timtum is totally in the issur. No, what we could say is, and I saw the Hisoris Chuvin Chelik Dalet Siman Lamed Zayin. He says, he quotes Reb Shimon Tzeifer, the Kruker of, who said that, no, b'di'evet, if someone ate shrotzim and didn't know about it, maybe we could rely b'di'evet that it's misasek. But it's definitely not a mahalach just to ignore what we see and just don't tell people. Taka de Mincha Shloima, in the later Tshuva, Tanyana Siman Samach Gimel, discusses this very beautiful question. But let's not forget that besides Timtum Alev, according to Kiva Eiga, if I know that you're about to eat something and you don't know that there's shrotzim in it, I'm going to tell you. So definitely it's not a heta as far as our question. Now, one thing we will say, if you only found one fly, Lamosha, the shah that I heard the other day, there was one fly in the soup. So the truth is, mi'ikadadin, there's no shayla on the rest of the soup. Because one fly is not indicative of a problem yet. And typically flies are not a siman of infestation. It could be from the air, it could be from the chasanol. Now, our question, of course, is fundamentally different. Our question, you found not just the mezumah, they found a minion of bugs. Mamish, the flour was infested. What's the halacha if the flour was infested, but you don't know what's doing with the schnitzel? So in Yeridei's Pei Dalet Sif test, that's our simon basically, the Shulchan Aruch says, if you found ktsas b'gdeira, if you found a few bugs, you take it out, clean it well, and the rest is mutter. But the Shulchan Aruch's lashon is, if you found one or two, so take them out, and the rest is okay. Aval shloisha oy arba hakol asa. If you found 3 or 4, then the whole pot of cholent is asa. Why? The lashon is mi'achash hochzik b'toyloyim. Now there's a key word. There's something called a chazaka that makes a shor hamuad 3 times, and there's something that makes food muchzik b'toyloyim. 3 or 4 bugs makes it muchzik b'toyloyim. I should mention the Bach Shita is even 2 bugs makes it muchzik. Like we find that an issur that marries twice and the husband dies both times is a katlanis. So the Bach holds 2, that's a deraisa, this is a deraisa, 2 is enough. But most poskim are doicha the Bach because the katlanis also involves, besides the issur deraisa, is also pekuach nefesh. So you have to be machmer. So I think most places can go with the Shulchan Aruch 3 or 4. 3 or 4 makes it muchzik b'talayim. In other words, if you found 3 or 4 bugs in the cholent, the entire cholent is awesome. At least put it on hold. We'll soon see what to do. Now, of course, it's strange, and halacha we're very, precise. 3 or 4, make up your mind. 3 is not 4. So men, the Taz and other paiskim say that really 3 is taka enough to make a muchzik, like Sharmud. The chiddush is, as we'll soon see, even if you found 4, but if you clean it out, the rest is mutter. So the chiddush is, the 4, even 4 is mutter if you clean it out. But, as we'll see, 3 is enough to make it muchzik. Rather, some say a chiddush, if you have a big pot of cholent, it's not logical that 3 is enough to make it muchzik, so then the number 4 is key. But no doubt about it, if a person found 3 or more bugs, the cholent is awesome. And we'll soon see how to remedy the problem. Let's say a person found 1 bug, took it out. A half hour later, another bug. A half hour later, a few minutes later, a 3rd bug. Do we look at it and say, well, each one put it to the side and starting again? The answer is ilbasa taima. Let's be logical. If you found 1 bug, you could assume it's just an occurrence. It maybe came from outside. If you found 3 bugs not even the same time, but in the same day, you have to be chayshish that it's infested. So basically, 3 bugs, you find 3 bugs, avada, it's muchzik. So right now, the cholent has an issur on it. But it's not an issur like chazer. The halacha is that if you find bugs in a food, after it's muchzik, either you could check the rest of it when shaykh, of course. You can't check a cholent, but if you find bugs in rice, you could check it carefully. And once you check it and you don't find, you could say it's okay. Muchzik means put it on hold. It's awesome, but put it on hold. Sometimes you could sift or strain the food. Lamashal, we'll soon see. If you make raspberry syrup, and there might be bugs in it because raspberries is very heavily infested. But if you strain or sift the bugs, so you remove the issur. So one of the 2 choices are enough to be makel. The Mechaber Grada says about if you found bugs in a tafshel, so even though the solid part is also because it has bugs, but if you strain with it, of course, you can't use a Lukshen strainer because that doesn't hold anything. You have to have something that has, the right approach, the right mesh, the right amount of it to make sure that it takes out any tiny particle. So the Mechaber says in the Chuch, even though it's muchzik a kol awesome, but you could sift the soup, the liquid, and nothing got through that sifter, and then the soup at least is mutter. Now you have to do it right. Again, a person can't live in dream world. You take a strain, a typical strain, or even a typical sifter that is not as fine as it's supposed to be. It's doing nothing. But one of the 2 eights is either bedika, if you know what you're looking for, or sinun, which means sifting it carefully. So let's apply this a little more specifically, so let's move on. The question is, if you can't do either the 2, l'mashal the schnitzel, there's no way to check. It's mixed up with the breading ingredients. So someone said, why don't we say that the bugs in the schnitzel is not just, not appetizing, it's repulsive. We know there's a whole mechaben yaredei, a kuv dalid of a tampogum. So let's say that any flavor that the bug gives is pogum. And that can be. Because the Torah asks it 4, 5, or 6 times eating bugs. Shrotzim are not very appetizing. So obviously the teretz is that's what Torah asks it. You can't just say I don't enjoy it. So the emphasis, if you think about it, no one's going to sit down and eat bugs, but some bugs are not really pogum. We don't eat them because we find it repulsive. But even if it is pogum, that's the issur. But really, I think the main lead that we have to try to follow is the famous yesod of bittul. Now, let's say a person has a cholent, no bugs, and a cup of milk fell into the cholent. So if he has shishim in the cholent, keneged the milk, then it's mutter. If there's no tam, that's the concept of bittul. In fact, both Pischei Tshuva, Kuf Tev Zayin Yud, Aruch HaShulchan, and Siv Chafei, and Kuf Tev Zayin, both say if a person asks the Rav, and the Rav says it's perfectly mutter. You have a big cholent, a small amount of milk, it's mutter. He says, no, I can't eat it, it's milky. So they both say there's a question of apikursis. The Torah says mutter, Chazal say mutter, and you say it's asa. In fact, some tzaddikim dafke ate, when Yisrael writes dafke to eat that, because you have a issur and hasapach laheta, so if you're up in that the sphere, you could follow that. But basically, avada and avada, it's mutter. So why don't we say that how much bugs you think is in the cholent or in the schnitzel? Let's say it's bottle. Now, I want to make a point. And this, the place you can see, Cotton Zion says it, but everybody says it from different angles. Insects in lettuce is not bottle, because not a teruvais. You can't find it, but it's hiding, it's camouflage. But insects in vegetables and fruits is not bottle, even though it's a small amount, because it's there. It's no teruvais. But in a cholent or in a schnitzel that it's mixed up in other ingredients, it is the halachic teruvais. But lamaisa, this doesn't work for the simple reason that a bug is called a barrier. Now, probably the word is Berya, but the Welt is Berya. I'll say Berya. But Berya, whatever the word is a complete insect. We find in halacha, l'mashal hilchos bracha, siman reish yud, if a person eats less than a gezayis, no bracha achrayna. But if he eats a Berya, a complete pomegranate seed, or a complete grape, there's a safek, he has to make a bracha achrayna. Because the fact that it's complete is a chashivus, and even without the shear, it's chashiv enough to mechayiv in a bracha achrayna. Now we don't do that lamaisa, we try to avoid eating a Berya, but no doubt about it, a Berya is chashiv. By us in Siman Kufs, actually the Shulchan Aruch devotes the whole Siman Kuf Yud to a Berya in Ilchas Kashrus. Berya, the Hainu Gain Mala, afilu be'elaf loy batla. This is the concept of Berya, that even if there's elaf alafim, is not bottle. And I want to give you just a mashal to crystallize this point. The Rashba in a Tshuva Chelik Aleph Siman Kuf Aleph, he says you have a pot that a fly fell into it. And there's a common shayla, unfortunately, but you have a pot of cholent cooking and you see a fly flying around. You say, you better not go into that pot. But sure enough, they makes a kamikaze landing into your cholent and you can't get it out. So the Mechaber says, unfortunately, the whole thing is asa, because a vaday bug in your cholent. Now, but the same Rashba says, let's say you take a spoon of the cholent, a liquid part of it, and you check carefully, there's nothing solid in the soup. That ate that spoon. More so, let's say you decide, fafalan, that's it, I couldn't find it, you throw out the cholent. Do you have to kasha the pot? So the Rashba, no. Question, Monashach. The whole cholent is asa, so why is a spoonful of liquid mutter and why is the pot mutter? The teretz is very pashut. The pot, the food is asa because the barrier asses the entire food. But the pot doesn't have a barrier in it. What's the worst scenario? What does the pot have? A tam of the barrier. Tam of the barrier is not a barrier, so it's batal b'shishim. So at worst, the pot is affected by a tam of the barrier, and that's batal. More so, the soup that you take out, if it's shaykh and a cholent, and there's no solid, all it has is, in the worst scenario, the flavor of the barrier. That's shishim, and shishim is mutter. But the point that we have to make is that when you have a barrier, even if there's a big volume, the chashash is it's there when you're eating it, and that's not mutter. So that's why Lamaisa, the Shulchan Aruch says, both in Kuf Pei Daled and Siman Kuf, if you have a complete bug in the food, regardless of the volume, it's awesome. Now, what the Taz does add in Siman Kuf, Sif Cotton Aleph, let's say you're not sure. You saw a fly flying around, and you don't see it. You didn't see it landing in the soup. So you have a suffix if the berry is in the soup. So the Taz says that you can be mekel. Because berya, as bad as it is only an issur d'Rabbanan, it's not a deraisa. So suffix d'Rabbanan, lahakol. But our case, you saw the fly going in, or our case, the flour was infested with berries, that's a much different problem. No. So, but the big question is, especially by a big cholent, especially that cooked overnight, you found it the next morning, for example, maybe we could assume that now After cooking, it's no longer Berya. You see, Berya is a very all-encompassing issur. But then again, as come out, all the Paiskim say, if it's missing even the slightest part of it, even an Eva she'ein Hashem tluya, it's missing a wing, a leg, an antenna. Once it's missing something, it's not a Berya. It's always kaplish machem. So ein lecha chasar, and I guess in this case, chasar na shleimus. The whole issur is the shleimus shabai. So why can't we assume, perhaps, that the fact that it was cooking, maybe it didn't fully disintegrate, but maybe at least a small part fell off. So now we're back to a issur that's not a berya. So then we'll say it's regular bittul b'roiv. In other words, even if it's infested, but how many bugs do you think there are? And even if there's 50 bugs, but in a big cholent, it's probably shishim. The enemy is berya. If I could assume it's always berya, l'char it should be mutter. This tam of that, all those bugs, tam is batel. Now, avada, a person's not allowed to eat a half a bug. It's an issur deraisa, chatzi shir, also min ha'torah. But in taruvos, when it became batel, maybe there's tzad to be mekel. So the emphasis is, we could say, iboy yisei mikra, iboy yisei misvara. First of all, lamaisa poik chazi. Bugs remain intact even when cooked. The Bereshta made all animals resilient, and all bugs and everything has its protection. You ever wonder why if a little fly doesn't freeze in the winter? There's the Bereshta made it. It has its ability to last. And the emphasis is that when they found the copepods in water, people tested it and cooked it in intense heat. It didn't fall apart. I just saw the Darkei Tshuva quotes one of the Paiskim that said he mamish studied it, and he cooked it, and he found it as whole as it was. So Pashat and Metzias is that does not fall apart in intense heat. Iboy yisei mikra, the Rashba, Aleph Kuf Aleph, ayite shenaf v'lesoich marek v'lei nimtzayim, is also, and we don't assume that it fell apart. But I would like to add a point. The Mechaben Kuf Aleph, Kuf Siv Aleph says the issur of berya. Then in Siv Beis he says Davashu Berishin is Bashal Maheta Imeinim Akiri Akolos. So bottom the Mechab is redundant. He says berya, and then he says it's cooked berya cooked in the food. Like, why do you have to repeat it? I know berya is also. So Ken Zayin, the Mechab is saying that even if you cooked it, and so don't think that maybe because you cooked it we can assume it's ice berya, it fell apart. No, Lamaisa a berya blibes. So Lamaisa, we're going to say that just the fact that it's cooked, we can't assume that it disintegrated totally, but even to the extent, we can't assume that a little part of it fell off. So far good, we are based on the Rashba. The plea is the Rashba himself in another sefer of his Teres HaBayis, and it's quoted by all the Paiskim, actually quoted the Shulchan Aruch, as we'll soon see. If a person has something that's called a miyot hamotzi, which basically means, let's say today, celery. Celery has bugs occasionally. It's not as bad as romaine lettuce. So in halacha, he's supposed to check a miyat hamotzi because it might be motzi. The question of the Rashba was asked is, if you had something like this and you didn't check it, you cooked it, now you can't check it. Zok the Rashba, it's mutter. Why is it mutter? You have a miyat hamotzi that maybe has bugs. So he says it's a svek sveika. First of all, miyat hamotzi means a miyat, don't forget. It's only a small chance. Maybe taka, the celery was not infested. And even if it's infested, listen to his Lukshen, the fact is, yesh kan beis sveikis, shem ha'yeh shem racha, shem ha'yeh. First of all, maybe it wasn't there. V'im tim shalom ha'yeh shem nimuach v'nis bashal. Maybe it was cooked. You made the gefilte fish and you put the celery in. So maybe if the bug was there, it fell apart. Or at least to the extent it's not a berya. So therefore, you have a svek sveika, and even by issur Torah halacha lahakol, as I state in the Rashba. The Rashba l'chayr says what he says in the Tshuva. The bigger problem is the Mechaba quotes the Rashba in the Tshuva, and in Siman Pei Dalet Sif Tes he quotes the Rashba in Teres HaBayis that the cholent, whatever you cooked with the miyat hamotzi, is mutter. No, is that a stira? Avadanat. And for us, it's very pashut. Because the starting point is, if you know that lamashal the barley was infested, and now you see it, the cholent is full of bugs. Do you have a right to assume that it fell apart the next morning? Teretz says no. If something is muchzik, that means we assume there's bugs there. So all you have left, the only last hope is it fell apart. Zok Prima Godim in Pei Dalad Lamed Beis, that Lamaisi you're dealing with the Safek Deraisa. This food is bugs. That's muchzik. Not just miyatama, it's muchzik. The Safek Nimuach is not enough of a Safek to be Matanis Deraisa. Like we said, Taka, because it's unreasonable that it falls apart. So if the starting point is issur deraisa, nimuach will not be matir. The Rashba was only matir in the case of a suffix. I want to give it a fancy, a miyat hamotzi, but it's only a suffix. So once the worst scenario is only a suffix, so the suffix nimuach might tilt the scale. And then is another reason, the Ran and Chulin that your Testament base, talking by a muchzik, ma'yikalameim, shemi nimuach bitlai, we quotes the Ben Yerucham. One, if it's a muchzik, if it's a vadai, then nimuach is not a factor. When can we use suffix nimuach? When it's only a suffix in the first place. So be'ika, it's only a suffix issur, then the suffix nimuach is able to tilt the scale. And like I told you, Dr. Chuv and Peidal Kuf Lamed Aleph quotes a Birchas Hamayim that he himself tested it, and the nimuach usually is not enough to make it fall apart. And you look in the Shulchan Aruch, Peidal test miyat hamotzi, if you cooked it, it's mutter, because as we said, it's a svek sveika. In Peidal Yud, Yirakas Muvushalem, Muchzik is asa, and in Siman Kuf, 3 sifim about a barrier being asa. So now let's talk tachlis. What's the halacha with our schnitzel that was made with a breading, a flour that was not just a question of miyat hamotzi, it was muchzik. They found a number, literally probably more than 1 million of bugs. So the emes is that if you could somehow check, I don't know how, but if you could check the breading and see if there's bugs, so that's what the Shulchan Aruch is making. But more probable that you can't check. You can't see, it's other ingredients. But it's not all lost. You could do something like the Shulchan Aruch's Eitzah, remove the breading, throw it out, and then the chicken part of it is mutter. Maybe the chicken has the tam of the breading that has the tam of the insects, so that's a tam of a barrier. In the worst scenario, that does nasa. So the Prima Godim really writes, the Shulchan Aruch really writes, you're allowed to be misanein, and the food that you strain, sifted, is okay. But I found more specifically, Mamash Kaman Our Shaila, the Prima Godim in Mishpah of Sifkot and Tezayin, he's not talking about breaded chicken, he's talking about basa, meat that was cooked in a pot that had bugs in it. Take out the meat, wash it off well, so there's no bugs in it, and it's mutter. Maybe he was affected by the tam of the barriers. Tam is bottle. So that would be an eitzah. Again, the rinse off the chicken just to make sure, but it's probable that there's no problem of the eimach zik and makal makal besides, but lamaisa, the chicken remains mutter after you peel off the outer layer that has the bugs. A cholent, pastas you can't sift because there's just so many small particles, and definitely you can't peel it. So be'emes, a cholent that is muchzik b'teloyim is a major problem. Mi'ikir din, mi'idin ha'shulchan aruch, it's a problem. Just to mention, I'm going to make it brief, badafka, because you can't pass what I'm going to say right now, but there are certain studim to be makel. The Dr. Tshuva says if you only found 3, it's interesting, 3 but not 4, maybe you could rely on the daya that holds only 4. Such a daya that I mentioned earlier. Also, the Aruch HaShulchan has an incredible chiddush in Kuf Sivkot and Yudzayin that maybe you could rely on the fact that bugs cooking in food is pogum, the tam of it, whatever the svara is, the shver svara. Some are makel by every barrier that is bottled in Tov Sof Kuf Samach. That's such a daya. Some are taka makel if someone doesn't know, so maybe you could rely on misasek. A rav should be consulted. But I could say this, that typically a pot of cholent, even a big volume that has muchzik b'taloyim, should be considered asa. Again, if a Rav knows the factors, there's a Chazanish's Chiddush. If a bug is so tiny that it's not nickel לעניים, it's there, but you mamish can't see it with your own eyes, avad tzasa. But maybe we could assume it's not a barrier. That's his big Chiddush. So again, I'm putting together big Chidushim, but typically the cholent would be a problem. But I want to suggest maybe that even if you hold it tzasa, maybe a daring approach. Everybody agrees the enemy is the barrier. If it's missing the slightest part of it, it's no longer barrier, and back to bittul b'shishim. So why don't we say serve the cholent, and let's hope for the best. What's the best? Someone has his bowl and there's no bugs in it, so gelungen, he's okay. Let's say Pliny eats a spoonful and there's a bug in it. But maybe we'll say as he's chewing the bug, the cholent I should say, he's also chewing the bug, so the le'isa makes the bug ois barrier. So you're back to bittul. So that doesn't sound right, because in your mouth, when you chew, even if you chew it and make it ois barrier, but is there shishim in your mouth? Let's say they hope for the best and the best happen. You chew the bug up and it's ois barrier. But in your mouth there's no shishim. In the cholent pot there's shishim, but not in your mouth. Plus, some small bugs like small barley, you don't necessarily chew it and doesn't fall apart. You swallow it. But the main problems of the Chidah and Shiurei Bracha, Siman Kuf, Sif Kat Nei, quoting a earlier seif I don't have, Masas Moshe, that Lamaisa, the issur is to chew tarfus. So if you assume that there's a bug, the issur is not only when you swallow, the issur is eating. What does eating mean? The le'isa. So the Lamaisa le'isa is asa. So it's not going to help that when you swallow it's ois barrier, it's you're eating a complete bug. So again, this heta le'isa is not very promising. Plus, if you know about the problem and you decide to hope for the best, that might also be an issur of aim of atlisachatchila. You put it in your mouth to be mevatel it, you mevatel lisachatchila, and that of course is a problem. Lamaisa, the halachic chazanish in Yeridea Yudalet Vav seems to be makel if you could assume that you chewed it and broke it in your mouth. That's his svar ayin sham. Maybe that's another sniff lahakal. but the poskim certainly are not being soymech on this in a regular case. Ma'isa shahayid is a true story. Someone made a cake. Either they used nuts or flour, but bekitza, either of the ingredients was what we call a miyut hamotzi. There were concerns about the fact that there might be bugs in it. The question is, b'di'eved, if it was made, what's the halacha? Halacha is taketz muta. Miyut hamotzi, if you didn't check, it's muta. Let's say they found that the flour or the nuts, they found it in the pantry l'mashal, was muchzik. And the assumption is what you put in the cake was also muchzik. So now we're not talking about a suffix, we're talking about a vadai. What's the status of the cake? A cake you can't check, and you can't be masan in it. Is the cake vadai yasa? Pashtis, it's vadai yasa. Zokt Taz, in Peidalad Yud Zayin, and again in Sif Kat and Chaf, maybe we'll assume that the heat of the baking caused the bugs to disintegrate. So we're back to a suffix, maybe it's barrier, or maybe it fell apart. Once it fell apart, we're back to bittul b'shishim. And the Taz seems to hold that the heat of baking causes the bug to disintegrate. And the Archaim HaKadosh in Pritoya, Sifkat and Chaf Aleph, he says that the Taz is inferring that Gam Aili Afiyah Mismayit Umikle Koli, and therefore it's Nimuach Nizbatel. So what he seems to be saying is that baking will make the bugs, if they're there, ois barrier, at least. However, this incurred the wrath of many other poskim. The Pri Chadash is very critical. He writes, Tzivkat Lam Gimel Ein Lo Yishachar, Lamaisa, it doesn't get disintegrate. Bugs like the Bershtam's creations could last the intense heat. So the Placey in Sifkat and Zayin tries to defend the Taz, but the way the Darka Tshuva writes, Sifkat and Kuv Beis, it really depends. If you have a worm is pretty big, that just survives, whatever, but it will not fall apart. Maybe a tiny mite, tiny little bug with intense heat, maybe that's, yeah. So Rav Ozna in the Tshuva and Chelik Hey, Peivav, and Zayin Kuv Chavav, is a certain sense makel like the taz if it's just at most tiny bugs with an intense heat. So that's something to keep in mind. If indeed you could falazach that the intense heat depends how much you baked it, of course. But if there was intense heat and the bug in the worst scenario was not a fly or a worm, but it was a tiny mite, maybe you could rely on the taz that it was nimuach in the mixture. Next question is a fascinating question. A person baked the cake on Tuesday and used a cup of sugar. The next time they used the sugar was Thursday, and they found ants in the sugar. So the question is, does that cast a doubt on the cake that you made on Tuesday? It's the same sugar. You didn't check the sugar in between. So Lamaisa, Thursday, it's Vadei Muchzik. Tuesday, who knows? I don't know. So this is a famous Taz in Yeridei at Peidal, Tzivkot and Yud Zayin. But in a much more challenging issue. It was Shavuos. Erev Shavuos, obviously, they baked foods. And the whole city used the same rozhenkes, raisins. Kamat kol ha'ir had the same raisins, the same soicha. And one of the nashim found bugs in the raisins, which is typical. Raisins could be often infested. Milben they found, actually. And they ran back to the soicha, and in his rozhenkes is also milben. So the question is, everybody that use these raisins and chalas, whatever they did, the whole city is going to be treif. So the Taz was asked this question, and he says, anything that was made or used before this Isha found the milben, the bugs, is mutter. Because we have a right to assume that when the infestation set in, from when we found it and beyond. But anything that goes backwards is okay. Where did the Taz get this radical chiddush from? He says, because we're allowed to assume that Lamaisa happened later. How do I know this? So listen to this. He says, our Rashba says Svek Sveik is mutter. What's the chance of Nimuach falling apart? Who said that? How could you rely on that? Teretz says, once you have a Svek Sveik, you can be Mekel. Zokti Taz, our case also. We have a right to assume that it only started the problem when you found it, and any time before, even a short time before, is okay. Now, he does agree. Those that bought after the issur was found, that's us. And you can't rely on the nimuach fact, the fact that it was baked. It's only one suffix. But what he's doing is he's using our Rashba of Svek Sveika, even though it's pretty much unreasonable, and so too in the raisin controversy. Now, Lamaisa, the Shach, and because Kesef writes, Loitav Hoira, he's wrong. You can't say that. A short while later, it's unreasonable, and you can't make such an assumption. And he proves that Ayin Sham, the Brichodesh also writes, Kedarka, pretty sharp, Divrei Havoi, what the Taz writes. So basically, most Paiskim, although I did see those that are Mekel, the Bach is Mekel like the Taz, but most Paiskim, and the way the Aruch HaShulchan writes it in Sifkan Ayin Ches, Rachuk Ma'oid Loima, that the infestation first began, just now, and not an hour ago or 2 hours ago. Now, but he does point out that because it's Rachuk Ma'oid to say such a thing. Now, but he does also adds, let's say the story would have been slightly different, that the Isha Taka found bugs, but the storekeeper in his store, he didn't find any bugs. So that wouldn't make a suffix on everything. So then you can be making with the rest of it. But as I said, most Paiskim do not accept the Taz's Kula. But what's interesting, the Aruch HaShulchan himself, and this is a Chavas Yar and a Tshuva in Kuf Yud Beis writes, let's say you found the food what was used with the rozhenkes was made a few days before you found the problem. So the main issue we have with the Taz is, how do you say that you found it at 10 o'clock? But 8 o'clock is okay. But a few days, actually, the Chavas Yar says a few hours, a nice few hours, 6 or 7 hours is enough to be makel. But definitely a few days in between, we definitely have a right to be soymech that the problem began after you made your rozhenkes in your food. But I want to make a point I think is important. The question that we began with, sugar, that had ants. Now that's probably fundamentally different, because ants in sugar is not a question of infestation, like you have mites or other insects in food from the fact that it was sitting there and then it started to get too much moisture, whatever attracts this infestation. Ants, as we see, when the summer comes, you wake up one morning and one of the children or grandchildren left a chewed up taffy on the floor, and you see a whole kahila of ants there. What's shot? It's pashut. It's attracted to sweets. They come and they go. It's possible that we could say that the case of sugar when ants is more of a tzad to be makel, especially if there are a few hours in between. We have two tzadim to assume that it happened later. First of all, let's say you made the cake on Tuesday. You found the ants and the sugar on Thursday. So right away you have one tzad to be makel, like the Aruch Shulchan says, a few days in between. But ants, as opposed to infestation, comes, with attraction. Now, why the sugar attracted the ants Thursday, not Tuesday, taka good kasha. But at least we have this tzad, that something that comes mibachutz, there's more of a tzad to be makel. I taka saw the Avnei Yoshvei in Ches Kuf Tezvav. He says that ants that you find, living ants, so obviously they are, I guess, new arrivals, and you could assume that the food that was made earlier maybe didn't have that problem. Yeah, person has to have a little bit seichel also to look around, see what's doing, but definitely ants, as opposed to mites and other infestation, there's more of a tzad to be makel. Story. Someone told me he took his family to see how wine is made, and one of the big wine manufacturers, and he was horrified. They have flies. They have grapes that they crush, obviously, to make the grape juice, and there are flies in it. So he started pointing to the workers. Do you see all those flies? He goes, just relax, take it easy. In other words, when they make wine, the assumption is they don't clean the grapes well, and there might be flies and other insects on the grapes. So how do we drink wine? So lamaisa, even though it's a small fraction of it, but the berry is not bottle. So lamaisa, there's a different teretz, and that's very pashut. And that is, when you drink wine, if you ever find flies, you're not going to drink wine from that company again. They're not going to sell wine with any impurity. The basic production is they squeeze the grapes, and they have a very efficient sifter that takes out any solids, including parts of flies, but certainly flies. So the assumption is that this is like using a sinun to remove any tarfus. No, sinun, avad is mutter. Now someone asks, but what about aim of vatl issur lechatchila? You're being mater and issur. So I told him what the Rashba says in Chelik Aleph Tav Tzadikei. Removing issur is not being mevatl and issur. Just like you're allowed to kasher a pot, Zok the Rashba, no one says kashering a pot of mevatl and issur. Mevatl and issur means you do something to eat the issur, to be mater and eat the issur. But here you're removing the issur. So you're left with kosher wine, so why is mevatl lechatchila? Sinun, the mechaber justifies, it's not mevatl and issur, it's removing issur, which is not issur. And we find a bigger chiddush, and this is important. In Yeredeya Pei Daled Yud Gimel, the Mechaber discusses, quoting from the Rishonim and the Orchos Chaim, Devash shenafla by nemalim, the ants are found in devash and honey. That's a problem, and you can't get it out simply. So the eight says yechamamu, cook it up, achiyu nitach v'sananu, until the honey is more liquidy. And then you could strain the ants, or sift the ants from the honey. Very good. So we're very accustomed to the straining part of it. But the bishul part of it, you're cooking in order to get out the ants. So what are you going to do about the tam of the ants? You're cooking it. So you're going to have to say, well, it's bottled. So that means you're relying on bittul. So forget about taking out the ants. But the problem is the bishul with ants isn't that mavatl and issa. So Zok the Taz and Shach, really the Orchos Chaim says it, Ein kavanaseinu el lasake nadvash. I'm not out to eat, ant-flavored honey. I'm just getting rid of this horrible problem. So there's no kavana to be mavatal, and that's okay. The Meishav David and Etziv and Chelik Beis Chavav, a beautiful tshuva, discusses making foods, amongst them wine that have mamish this shayla that have bugs in it. And he says the fact that you're not kavana to have the taste of it, you're getting rid of it, that's the heta of making wine, even though there might be flies in the initial process. a little more of an issue, but it's probably the same idea. Raspberries is not just miyotamotzi, is infested, heavily infested. And taka, we don't use raspberries on a regular basis, or even on an irregular basis, I should say. But here we use raspberries in one case, and that's the favorite that people have, the raspberry syrup, which has presumably a good hechsha. And the question is, how do they do it? So it's really the same idea. It's the process of getting the juice of the raspberries, but again, it's a very, very fine process of removing any impurities. So it's not just mimavatal it, it's straining and sifting it, removing the issur from the heter. Now, you might ask, but lamaisa, in the process, isn't some of the tam of the bugs going into the syrup? So that, in the worst scenario, ein kavanaseinu levatal issur, but to get rid of the issur. A little more of an issue is people have certain vegetables, soup greens that they feel they can't be without, which are really heavily infested. So some use a spice or a mesh bag, but it's all the same idea. It's a bag if it's made right. I can't say all are made right, but if it has, again, the right design that doesn't let anything through, I'm not talking about a sifter that's just good for Lukshen but nothing else, but something that's made, 75 I think is the number, Berich, and that range, but basically it has the right amount that it will let nothing out. So we could assume that it lets the flavor of the particular vegetable into the soup, but contains and withholds any bug that's there. But here the problem is you're cooking initially for the vegetable with the bugs. The Megadim in Shin Peidal, in Sif Seidah, sorry, Lamed Zayin, is not too happy about it. But the Megadim in Archaim, in Eish Lavram, Tofnon Gimel, Sifkat and Gimel says the same yisoid. You don't want the bug flavor, you want the vegetable flavor. So again, I'm just telling you, if you do it, you have to do it right. Some people buy the right bag, but they don't close it properly. So if you have a concern of bugs floating into the soup. But if you do it right with the right bag and the right method of doing it, we have this heter, which is really based on the machaba, that if your kavanah is to get rid of the bugs by this process and you contain the bugs, it doesn't go through, that might be mekel. That's not to be mekel. That some tea use leaves that might be infested, but again, the tea bag itself is that built-in sifter. What's a little more challenging, some people ask, they have Lukshen, green Lukshen. Now, it's not moldy Lukshen. It's Lukshen that really, they market it as spinach Lukshen. Now, I'm not getting into which brand is done right or not, but the question is, how could you serve Lukshen ever that has spinach? Spinach is very heavily infested. We don't even see spinach typically that's edible. So here, again, if it's done right, there is a tzatvi mekel that they take the spinach and they clean it as best as can. And now the spinach is brought down from a muhzik level to a suffik, or maybe even a miyat motzu, ain't a motzi, but in either case, something that is not a vadei issur. So now we could say, ein mevatlin issur lechatchila daika. You can't take regular spinach and shred it to powder, even though there's no longer any barriers, because you want to be able to use the vegetables. Now you can't say I want to use the vegetables. I forget about the worms, because you're taking the food that's muhzik, that's asa, and being mavatal it. But if you bring it to a level that's no longer issa, a suffix, and then you grind it, so you're not mavatal issa, and now at the end of the day it is no longer a barrier, and that's what those that use this vegetable are falazichan. You find bugs in hot cereal, a common occurrence, so you have to know, if it's infested, you have to, once you found one, so you have to check for more. I'm not saying you're mechuyev to, but you should, because again, once you find these type of things, either there's a lot or none. If you find a fly, so you could, or an ant, it could be from externally, but if you find something that typically is infested, check it and know what you're checking. And then you could hope that it's just 1 or 2, less than 3. If you did check, it would be mutter. Quinoa today is a popular grain. It's not a grain actually, but it's a grain substitute. Quinoa is muhzik b'talayim, so approach with great caution before you use it. Rice, again, the Marsham already writes about chelik tesim and nun tes about the problems with rice. Brown rice is much more of a problem You have to check it, lay it out, check it, know what you're checking. White rice, typically any impurities were removed before, but people standard try to check even white rice, but it's put on a plate, a white plate, you see, if there's anything moving, anything there, that's not rice. The Chaim, Peidal, Ksif Kat, and Kuf Mem, a person found a worm in bread. So, about the worm in bread is also. So he says, cut out that piece of, the worm and this area surrounding it, and the rest is muta, again, because we assume that it's only one, and this is not typically you don't find, lots of worms. It came in, like everything else, it happens. How can I not mention, it's almost Pesach, that, one of the greatest sakonis of Pesach is when people have lettuce, romaine lettuce that weren't checked properly. It's yadua, romaine lettuce is musik b'taloyim, and it has to be done properly. Now, there are different methods. I'm not getting involved with the details, but you have to be an educated consumer and to know the following. If you have a hechsher you could rely on, that they checked it properly, so gesund dehait. If you don't have a hechsher, or else you don't have it available, so the leaves are muhzik and it's very hard to check properly. Many people that have no other alternative, they don't have these brands available, they will just throw away the leaves and just use the stalks, which you could check, you could see, you could clean it off, you could rub your finger over it, and if there's any bugs, hopefully you get rid of it. But the stalks pose much less of a problem. But the ick is to take the sugya, take it seriously. People check, but they don't know what they're checking for. People check, and their eyesight is very poor. They couldn't see an elephant on the lettuce, even if it was there. But a bug, a tiny bug. But let me read the words of the Chassam Sofer that have to, be ner l'ragleinu. In Archaim Kuf Lamed Beis, he says, I'm ragil always to mention Shabbos HaGadol, that if you don't have people that know what they're checking for, don't use romaine lettuce that are soyim ma'oid taloyim. So it's not a heintige b'shagas, quote unquote. Chassam Sofer says, don't use it if you can't do it properly. The Mishnah in Pesachim says that the preferred min of Mara, the first, is the lettuce. So he says, good. So for a hiddur in the mitzvah rabbanan, you're going to eat shrotzim that they're kamalavim. He says, there's an alternative. Use horseradish, the chrein, the white stuff. So that's certainly bug-free. It's a wonderful option. So either get lettuce that you could rely on the hechsha, do it yourself properly, or best would be when you use the horseradish and avoid all sveikas. Someone asked me, interesting shaila, he found 3 partial bugs in the food that I was eating. The cholent, I think it was. So I'm not making an autopsy. I have to have the coroner's office. Is it 3 halves? Is it really 2 and 1? But manashach, that would be okay. After you check more. Because lamaisa, 3 halves, either the bishul was so intense that it made it nimuach, or else the halves are really part of a whole. So you're only back to 1 1/2. But in either case, you're not yet muhzik. A person found fly in his, true story, a fly in his soup Friday night by a big seudah, the big oilam. Should he alert the people? Should he tell the people? Should he be quiet? So first thing is, first think. 1 fly in a soup, in the worst scenario, is not a muhzik. It could be king. Again, from the hall, from the serving, these things are very common, almost unavoidable. If he found 3 or more, so that's muhzik. But 1, so you have a right to assume, you don't have to say anything. If he found 3 or more, does he have to tell people? So that's back to our misasik shaila. And basically, we do not rely on misasik as a heta. And basically, you have to tell whoever's in charge to handle it properly. Now, they might run to a rav. He might rely on any of the previous heterim. That's up to the rav. But basically, can't just ignore the issue. And last but not least, I wanted to mention that we can't do every possible shaila, but I think this is a good cloud. The summer's coming, heat's coming, people go to the mountains. These are all more suspect to shailas. Person's outdoors, or even in a bungalow, in a porch, there are a lot of bugs outside. Especially on a porch, you're eating supper at night, it's very comfortable, cozy. But don't forget, it's dark outside, there's a light in your porch. Bugs are attracted to lights. Sometimes they get burnt by the lights, whatever the case is, but it's very common that there are bugs that end up in food. I would read the Lach and the Chachmas Adam in Lamed Ches Chaf, Roy la'adam mistakel b'ma she'oichel. Before you eat, just take a casual look. And he writes, Umeid ani alai, on myself. Shekama v'chama pa'amim nitzalti aydei baruch Hashem. Now this is not OCD. It's not nerving. Especially when there's more chashash from external problems. So a casual look, see what's doing. And again, the hot summer, the outdoors, the lights, hakol lefi azman. But if a person is a bolataya, it'll be messianos. I got to talk to you.
Shem Irgen Shirtalik give be a shekert or a smith of today's shir, Bez Hashem after Kaddish, or smith says seek him of the shir. Chananya ben Akashem el Teresh Baruch Lazakas is so the figure here on Torah Mitzvah Shem Adonai Chofetz Man Sitka Yagdol Terviyade.
How's the young couple?
He reminded me.
You are the young couple.
He reminded
Your child is a younger, and your youngest is the grandchild. That's gone. Next time. How you doing? Young couple. How's the youngest couple? The youngest couple. How they doing? Holy Land?
Rabbi, so we're not being vatal the sikkim of the teishi and the insects and halacha.
So just what we learned today, Bez Hashem, first and foremost, it's a very serious matter. It's multiple issurim, timtum alev. There's no heta of misasek. The fact is that a person is eating something, he's responsible for that, like kivega, certainly so. And even if you hold it is a misasek, but there's still a timtum alev. There's no head to the fact that bugs are pogum, that's bahachi asra toira. A barya is an issur even be'elef halafim, like almost all paiskim. If it's missing any part of it, it's ois barya. If you could assume that the bug lost part of it, then it's an easy shaila of bittul b'shishim. The tam of a barya is mutter, and that's why the pot or the food that you strained is vadei mutter. If something is muchzik, you can't assume that there's nothing else. You have to either make a efficient bedika, checking, or a sinun. Lamaisa, when a person made schnitzel or any food with ingredients that was mursik b'taloyim, if you can't check or strain, then taka the food is awesome. If it's a hefsid merubu or a tzairah gadol of a big oilam, a Shabbos seudah, could ask a rav, there might be factors, but basically this is the approach. The fact that in your mouth you might break the barrier, that's not a heta, as we said, a number of reasons why it's not. There's a problem of but basically, if you made food with an ingredient and a few days later you found that that ingredient was mursik b'teloyim, you have a right to assume that it didn't happen when you made it. And especially if you have the question of ants that are a problem that come and go, a few days is certainly it's out to be makel that the food that you made then was okay. Many foods that are made with potential bug problems, they rely on the sinun, the mashal making of the wine, of syrup, even some mesh bags, tea. The point is that we get rid of the bug or contain the bug, and the time of it is bottled. Quinoa is mursik b'talayim, check it very carefully. Rice, white rice, and it's probably a miyat hamatzui, and the brown rice you should check more carefully. Pesach, only use lettuce that you know there are no bugs. Better to use the horseradish than a suffix of kamalavim. A fly in a soup, you don't have to alert the oilam. If you find bugs in a food, the oilam must be told. And the Chacham Zadam advice to just a casual look, especially during the summer, especially outdoors, casual look to see that everything is okay, and a bolatayim messiah. Yes, Rabbi.
Why